Thank you so much, everybody, for lasting it out. This is the last session of the day, and I'm extremely pleased to be chairing this session. My name's Professor Francis Green from the UCL Institute of Education. I'm leading up one of the projects in CG, the project on graduate labour markets, and I serve also on the Research Management Committee, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Claire Callender, who's going to speak to us in this last session. Claire is Professor of Higher Education Policy in not just one but two universities. So we got two for the price of one today. And that is to say she's part-time here and part-time across the park in Birkbeck College. She's also, for her pains, the Deputy Director of CG, and therefore a very important person. She has been the expert on countless studies, government studies on student finances, and particularly on the plight or otherwise of part-time students, and very much an advocate for part-timers in higher education in Britain for many, many years now. And indeed, last year, 2017, she was awarded an OBE for her services to higher education. So we have a very distinguished person here to speak to us at the end of the day. Her topic concerns the subject of choice and inequality. Now, those are two big concepts which find a remarkable tendency to be associated with each other in a number of different fields, shall we say. And as an economist myself, I know how when markets get involved and choice gets involved, somehow inequality seems to crop up at the end of the day. So tracing the connections between choice and inequality is something that's very important, and Claire has chosen for herself this topic today. So without any further ado, over to Claire.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. I want to start with a quote from Julian Legrand. He argues that models for delivering public services that rely on significantly upon user choice coupled with provider competition are more likely to deliver high-quality services efficiently, equitably, and in a responsive fashion. Legrand continues that for choice and competition to operate effectively, the money must follow users' choice, and there must be a variety of types of providers and of provision, with new providers entering the market and failing ones exit. And users must be properly informed. Legrand defines choice in terms of the what, where, how, when, and who. In the context of higher education, the where would include which HE institution a student chooses. What might cover their qualification aim, subject, or curriculum. How could include mode of study, when they study full-time or part-time, face-to-face or distance learning. While the who might involve who teaches the students, world-renowned professors or PhD students. And according to Legrand, the principle of choice in public services includes decisions in all these dimensions. Legrand defines competition as the presence of a number of providers, each of which are motivated to attract users of their service. And so in this talk, I hope to show how this model for delivering public services, rooted in basic economic theory, have informed the development of higher education policy in England. In addition, I will show how central to this choice and competition agenda are the student funding reforms, with the introduction of cost-sharing policies, particularly tuition fees and student loans. And I hope that the focus of this analysis will be on the idealization of choice in policy rhetoric. Then I'll examine some ideas about how we conceptualise choice, and finally I'll explore some of the consequences of the choice agenda in relation to student funding. And I want to take as my case study the 2012 funding reforms for part-time students. And here I hope to show the illusion of choice. I'm going to start with the Deering report, because it's within the Deering report that we see the emergence of the rhetoric on student choice and provider competition. This most comprehensive report had a laudable vision of a learning society while lifelong learning was central. This vision drove the report's focus on student choice and the desire for a more responsive higher education system. The report is important because it basically laid the foundations of our current system of student funding that in essence have remained largely unchanged since its original proposals, except for the amount of money or loans that students are required to take out. So the report cemented the notion of cost sharing. It established the principle that graduates should contribute to the cost of their higher education through tuition fees repaid by income contingent loans. It proposed a funding regime which was aligned with the philosophy that market regulation was the most effective way to ensure efficiency and quality. And so it paved the way for the 2006 reforms of student funding and the 2012 reforms of student funding. What's important is the way the report argued that student choice should be the main shaper of the system and that institutions must be enabled to respond flexibly. Consequently, the report rejected the idea of block grants approach to funding tuition because block grants were too inflexible and insensitive to student demand, and it meant that funding bodies largely determined what subjects students can study and at what institution. Instead, the report argued for a system in which public funding flows to institutions on the basis of student choice. For Deering, this approach meant that students' choice determined the shape of the system and institutions are encouraged to respond in order to maintain or increase recruitment and income, while tuition fees, and I quote, would enable students to be more demanding of their institutions. The report explores numerous options for how funding should follow the student and options for increased student contributions. In the end, it opted for income contingent loans, for contributions for both tuition fees and for students' living costs, for full-time students, but not for part-time students. Such provision for part-timers was considered far too expensive. So part-timers had to continue to pay their fees up front and out of their wages or social security benefits. Now, as some of you may recall, or the older people in this audience, on the day that the report, the Deering report, was published, in July 1997, the newly elected Labour government and David Blunkett, the Education Secretary, announced its own proposals, basically sweeping aside Deering's recommendations for full-time students. The flat rate £1,000 tuition fee for all undergraduates to be repaid by income contingent loans was swept aside. Instead, there will be means-tested tuition fees paid up front. Also, means-tested income grants for living costs were abandoned and were replaced exclusively by maintenance loans for all students. The subsequent 2006 funding reforms and the ideas underpinning them largely reiterate Deering's thinking. Fees were increased to £3,000 for all students to be repaid by loans, and grants were reinstated. Now, for reasons of time, I want to jump straight to the Brown Review. The independent review of higher education funding and student finance chaired by Lord Brown, was launched in 2009 and reported within the year. The economic context within which the review operated was one of a global recession and unprecedented cuts in public expenditure, and this is absolutely paramount for understanding the review's recommendations and the coalition government's response to them. So too is the political context and the government's ideology. But the Brown report is limited in scope and in vision. Its vision was of a sector whose purpose and role was defined by the market, very much in line with Legrand's thinking that I presented at the outset of this presentation. There were 6 main principles underpinning the Brown report, and one of them was that, and I quote, student choice should be increased so that choices shape the landscape of higher education. And the report explicitly links choice to student funding and tuition fees. They have a pivotal role. In the Brown report, block grants stifle growth and competition. They limit student choice, so funding must follow the student. The report recommended that nearly all government funding to universities should be withdrawn and transferred to individual students via loans to pay for higher fees. Higher education institutions would compete for students based on price and quality, while theoretically student choice would drive up quality, drive down price through efficiency gains. The Brown report also sought to provide greater student choice and provider competition by enabling the development of more diverse and flexible higher education provision, with more variety in the range and the nature of that provision. And essential to that was part-time study. So another key principle underpinning the report, principle number 4, was Brown argued that there would be no upfront costs for any student regardless of their mode of study, giving students more choice about how they chose to study and where. Another key principle underpinning the Brown report was principle number 6, where he argued that part-time students should be treated the same as full-time students for the costs of their learning, so they're not deterred from studying part-time and more people can access higher education. The report therefore recommended that student loans should be introduced for part-time students. So what was the coalition government's response to the Brown report? Their ideas are primarily encapsulated in their white paper, Higher Education, Students at the Heart of the System. And once again, the white paper largely repeated Brown's thinking. The overall goal was for a higher education system that was more responsive to students' choice, where student funding followed students' choice. And this is clearly articulated in this quote from the report. Now, as we know, tuition fees were raised to £9,000, repayable via loans, and loans for part-timers were introduced. And the white paper suggested, and I quote, that putting financial power into the hands of the learners makes student choice meaningful. And more specifically, we want to ensure that the new student finance regime supports student choice, and that in turn, student choice drives competition, including on price. Of course, the government's assumption that there would be variable tuition fees never materialised, as in 2006, the £9,000 fee has become a de facto flat rate, much to the chagrin of Willetts and the current government, but very much in line with Deering's original thinking. So government rhetoric about choice and competition continues today. It's loud and clear in the 2016 White Paper, in the terms of reference of the Office for Students, and in the review of the post-18 education and funding. So to summarise so far, from my analysis it's quite clear that student choice is central to the reforms of student funding in England. Both the funding methodology and mechanisms introduced, particularly the move away from block grants to funding that follows student choices, namely tuition fees, and the introduction of student loans, which act as a voucher that students can redeem at the institution of their choice, have played vital roles in this choice agenda and in the move towards the marketisation of higher education. These documents illustrate the idealisation of the workings of the market by politicians and policymakers. They talk about choice only in positive terms, the positive effects, the positive outcomes. They are blind to any negative impacts and the values that choice and markets and competition engender. They are blind to the winners and the losers. So let's think a bit more about how we can conceptualise student choice. Despite all these governments' calls for greater student choice, none of these documents define what they mean by choice or spell out in detail what choices are involved. These documents do not explore whether or not individuals should enter higher education. They assume that given the financial returns, entry isn't the only rational choice. They subscribe to a human capital perspective of choice making, where people weigh up the costs and benefits of higher education. Nor do they thoroughly examine the where, what, how, when of choice as outlined by Legrand. None of these documents investigates how students make choices or the very real complexity of their choices. If we conceive of higher education as a market, as these documents and government policies want us to do, then we have to acknowledge how the complexity of this market makes it actually very difficult for prospective students to make good, informed choices. First, because higher education is a service, it's intangible. Second, the range of choices is very large. What might suit one student may not suit another. Thirdly, as HE is a service, it has a high experience value, but it's nearly impossible to choose a course before experiencing it. Most students only attend higher education once. They can't learn from experience. Finally, the outcomes are uncertain and depend on the ability and commitment of each student as well as on the quality of the provider. In addition, the employment outcomes for full-time students are highly variable, as the LEO data suggest. They depend on students' subject of study, the university they attend, their grades, and crucially, their socio-economic background. Now, the academic literature on college choice predominantly emanates from the US. Hostler and Gallagher, in their classic study, identify three phases, a three-phase model to depict student choice. The first choice, predisposition, relates to students' desire to attend college. The second involves their search for information about universities upon which to base their choice of institution. The final phase, students narrow their choice set to specific institutions, and it's at this stage that financial considerations and aid packages play a very significant role. Now, Perner extends this model. Her model incorporates the economic model of human capital investment and a sociological model of status attainment, including ideas about habitus, cultural and social capital, and the organisational context, to create a model centred on environmental factors that influence students' college choice. The model, therefore, highlights the situated context in which attitudes towards higher education are formulated and choices are made. And she suggests that choices are shaped by 4 nested contextual layers. Firstly, the student and family context. Secondly, the school and community context, the higher education context, and the broader social, economic, and policy context. So I too assume that students' attitudes towards higher education and their choices are shaped by these 4 nested contextual layers. I suggest that when students choose whether or not to study, where to study, what to study, they assess the expected costs and benefits of investing in higher education consistent with human capital theory. But this assessment, including the risks, is done in very broad terms. But students' subjective understanding and perceptions of these costs and benefits, their views about their academic and financial resources, and their higher education choices are shaped by their socio-economic background and other resources that they derive from their cultural and social capital. And in turn, these are shaped by unequal social forces, with the result that student educational choices reflect and reproduce social inequality. As Ray et al. Have argued, choices are bounded by the framework of opportunities and constraints the person finds herself in, her external circumstances. She is also circumscribed by an internalized framework which makes some possibilities inconceivable, others impossible, and a limited range acceptable. Put simply, individual choices are shaped by who they are and where they come from. They are shaped by social structures and social inequalities. Critically, it is these social dynamics of choice-making that are totally absent from the choice and competition rhetoric we find in government policies and government documents. But as Doherty argues, the choice agenda, while seemingly to be seen as, or can be seen as desirable and fair, actually legitimates social inequality. It builds and extends social disadvantage. We blame the victim for making so-called suboptimal choices. But suboptimal choices are not randomly distributed, as the literature on undermatching shows. They are most common amongst the most disadvantaged. So choices are socially stratified. Educational choices stratified. So how does this manifest itself in terms of actual student funding policies introduced to promote and improve student choice? Are choices limited and constrained? Is choice an illusion? And I want to explore this in relation to part-time students and specifically the reforms introduced in 2012-2013. And by way of context, it's useful to see what's been happening to part-time student numbers. And basically what this graph illustrates quite neatly is the long-term decline in part-time students, especially since 2008. And we have to remember that at its peak in 2008, 45% of all students studied part-time. Today, 20% do. And of course, this is because year on year, part-time student numbers have fallen, while full-time student numbers have increased. But what this graph also shows is the dramatic changes since 2012. Now, there have been numerous explanations for this long-term decline. Above inflation increases in tuition fees, inadequacies in student support, the ending of funding for most graduates taking a second degree, the recession and other microeconomic factors, supply factors as universities' income from part-time study fell behind the income possible from full-time provision, and the rise of unrecorded learning opportunities like unaccredited courses at universities, courses delivered by alternative providers, and the growth of massive open online courses, namely MOOCs. All these factors play a part. None of them are mutually exclusive. And as others have suggested, there was pressure from all sides. So let's look now specifically at the 2012-13 reforms. What did they actually do or say? Well, the key way in which they affected part-time students is that the existing means-tested grants and course grants were abolished. They were replaced by tuition fee grants, and the reduced block grants to higher education institutions led to large increases in tuition fees that were capped at £6,750. Now, this is a quote from the White Paper. It's clear from this quote that the government hoped that the changes would open up access and stem the long-term decline in part-time higher education study, and consequently broaden students' choices. But these reforms have had the opposite effect. They've both constrained and limited student choice. Indeed, these reforms largely explain the spectacular and persistent falls in part-time undergraduate enrolments. And this slide shows some of the consequences of the changes. The first thing that happened, of course, was a massive increase in tuition fees. For example, at the Open University, its fees between 2011 and 2012 increased by 247%. Now, interestingly, we don't have any data for the sector as whole as to the amount, what the fees were in 2011. We still don't have any data nationally on what tuition fees are for part-time study. But we have estimates for 2012 that suggest that university part-time degree courses, the median fee in 2012 was £5,000. So across the sector as a whole, fees increase, and these increases were greater than the sector had ever seen before. This slide shows the fall in numbers since 2010. And I'm taking 2010 as the starting point because it was the last year not affected by the 2012 fee increases for entrants. In 2010, there were 216,000 entrants. By 2015, the numbers had fallen to 106,000, a fall of 51%. At the Open University, the falls were greater, 63%, than the falls at other colleges and other universities and FE colleges in England, where the fall was 45%. Now the question is, what impact, if any, did that have on enrolment? Did these fee increases have on these numbers? What we can do is we can compare trends in entrance domiciled in England with those domiciled in Scotland and Wales who were unaffected by the 2012 reforms. And in that way, we can begin to isolate the impact of tuition fees and the extent to which the tuition fee increase caused the decline in entrance. And open university data provides the most convincing evidence, because with data from the Open University, we can compare like with like. The Open University broadly offers the same courses to students studying in England, Scotland, and Wales. And this slide presents data exclusively on the Open University. What it shows is that between 2007 and 2011, there is basically no change. Okay? Doesn't like, fine. Sorry, there isn't a pointer. So what it shows is that between 2007 and 2011, the fees are the same for entrance in England, Scotland and Wales. So unsurprisingly, the trends are very similar. Between 2011 and 2012, students from England saw a real increase in their fees, as I've already suggested, of 247%, compared to an increase of fees of just 2% in Scotland and Wales. So by 2012, we see a decline of 43% in students living in England, whereas in Scotland and Wales, there's next to no change. Since 2012, there's been a further decline in England that's been matched by falls in Scotland and Wales too. But, as this chart shows, the red line, the falls have been greater in England than they have in Scotland and in Wales. We can also compare changes and trends between England and Wales in terms of entrance amongst students at other institutions, not the OU, but other institutions and FE colleges. For technical reasons, we can't do that for students in Scotland. And if the numbers in England had declined by the same proportion as those living in Wales, who again were unaffected by the tuition fee increases, in 2015, we estimate that there would have been 149,000 students instead of 106,000 students. This suggests that at least 40% of the decline in English domiciled entrance can be attributed to the 2012 reforms. In other words, there are 43,000 fewer students than actually would have been the case without these changes. In other words, what this analysis stressed is the way in which increases in tuition fees caused some of the decline in English entrance to universities. So these falls in entrance clearly demonstrate how students' choices have been severely limited and constrained by the rise in tuition fees, and this is manifest by their absence. Now, the student loans that were introduced in 2012 for part-time students were specifically designed to protect students from these tuition fee rises, to make part-time study more affordable and to safeguard access. But they haven't, because the loan eligibility criteria are far too restrictive. Less than half of all students in 2015 actually were eligible for loans. Without loans, potential students have to pay up front out of their own pockets or abandon the idea of studying. And as Lorraine Dearden and other research in the UK and elsewhere repeatedly shows, upfront fees and fee increases have an adverse effect on participation unless they are accompanied by equivalent increases in student support. Indeed, these eligibility figures make a mockery of the Brown's Report declaration that higher education will be free at the point of entrance for all students, regardless of mode of study, giving them more choice about how they choose to study and where. But what about the take-up of loans? And again, we are completely restricted. The reason why these figures are 2012 and not 2015 is because these are the only data available. We can't look at the take-up of loans except for the first year that they were introduced. What they show is around 59% of students who were eligible for loans in 2012 took one out. This compares to well over 90% amongst full-time students. So overall, only about a quarter of all part-time students are eligible for loans. Now clearly, some part-time students are willing to borrow. However, as the dramatic falls in enrolment demonstrate, for many, part-time study is now too expensive. It is simply unaffordable. And as government research confirms, part-timers are far more price-sensitive and debt-averse than their younger full-time peers, probably because they're older, they've got families, and they've got existing financial commitments. Their reluctance or inability to pay higher fees up front or via loans is absolutely understandable, especially if we recognise the sociological dynamics of choice. Taking out a loan and having to pay, in reality, an additional 9% in marginal tax to repay that loan, or more than £6,000 a year for fees, is a leap of faith when the returns on their investment are unknown and are uncertain. As research repeatedly demonstrates, the financial returns from lifelong learning in terms of higher earnings and improved employment opportunities are mixed. Now, everybody in this room is a potential part-time student. Some of you may be. But how many of you would get a pay rise if you got another degree tomorrow? Not many of you. And yet the government justifies student loans because of the assumed financial returns and their belief that who benefits pays. And the government's current answer to trying to revise this decline in part-time numbers is just to increase opportunities to take out more loans by relaxing the eligibility criteria or by introducing maintenance loans, which it's going to do next year. But the evidence suggests that more loans will not have a great impact. Loans have not worked to date and are unlikely to work in the future. Loans are unlikely to reverse the decline. Crucially, the decline in numbers shows that for many, the alternative to loans is not paying fees up front, it's deciding not to study. More loans will not enhance student choices, they will continue to limit and constrain their choices. Now, what about the impact of student funding on what students can study? Have these changes changed the nature of provision in any shape or form? And if so, how have they changed provision? And can these changes in provision be linked to student funding? Now, students who want or need a loan can no longer gain a degree by building up institutional credits over a number of years and coming in and out of study. Instead, they have to commit to undertaking a degree or a particular qualification at the outset because of the loan eligibility criteria. They can't take courses under a year because they can't get a loan. They can't study at an intensity of less than 25% because of the eligibility criteria for loans. And consequently, there's been a very dramatic shift in students' qualification aims and in their intensity of study. And here's the evidence. What this table shows is that between 2010 and 2015, the number of non-degree students, of students taking non-degrees has fallen much more rapidly than the number of degree entrants. So what's been lost are many vocationally orientated, short continuing education type courses. Similarly, there's been a massive change in intensity of study. There was a 64% decline in the total number of entrants studying on courses of less than 25%. So not only are students choosing not to do these courses, but also higher education institutions are modifying their provision, as this graph shows, so that more students can qualify for loans. So finally, have student reforms contributed to further social inequalities in higher education? The dramatic decline of part-time study does have consequences for social equity and for social mobility. Part-time study provides a way into higher education for those who haven't followed the traditional route. It gives people a second chance. And the evidence shows, for the small number of part-time entrants who are young, that indeed there's a much higher proportion of young part-time students coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. But garnering evidence on social mobility and social equity for part-time students is much more problematic. For a variety of reasons, none of the standard measures that we use to measure social mobility can be used for part-time and mature studies. But those most affected by these declines are groups that are traditionally widening participation groups, namely those aged over the age of 35 and with low or no qualifications. Moreover, provision have been concentrated, is now more than ever concentrated in non-Russell Group universities. Basically, the Russell Group have pulled out of part-time study. So to conclude, the demise of the part-time undergraduate sector in England is clearly related to the 2012-13 reforms. It's one of the victims of these policy changes. It's one of the unintended consequences of the government's choice agenda. In the government's own terms, it's clear that there's been a market failure. Student choices have been limited and constrained. If the government is really committed to choice and competition, then and opening up access and making part-time study more affordable, it will need to take some radical action. But it will also need to reconsider its idealisation of the market and the effects of choice and the dynamics of competition, if choice is not to be an illusion and contribute to further inequalities. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for a stimulating and I hope controversial contribution this evening, and I'm anticipating some questions from the audience and maybe from our audience, our external audience perhaps as well. So have we got some roving microphones ready? Okay, so can we start with the gentleman from the back, Hugh Morris, I know, from Wales.
Thank you. Hugh Morris from the Welsh Government. So before I ask the question, there's a quick statement. You've outlined the position in England very effectively. The situation in development administrations, as you indicated, is somewhat different. In Wales, it wasn't just reducing the tuition fees for part-time students, it was also direct funding of the OU, which enabled it to maintain its provision. The funding review, which is recently completed in Wales, will increase the funding for part-time students from this September. So not only will they have tuition fee support, there will also be maintenance grants for living costs for part-time students up to £5,000. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the experiences of developed nations. I'm conscious that there are 3 reviews happening in England of higher education funding at the moment. There's a House of Lords Economy Committee review, there's a House of Commons Education Committee review, and obviously there's the Prime Minister's Philip Auger review. It seems to me that the sort of evidence you've outlined, and perhaps the experience of developed administrations, could help England not only to address equity issues but also productivity issues.
Yeah, I mean, the key. Do you want to take 3 at a time?
If you ask them, and then
there is a major productivity issue which I haven't talked about, because of course part-time study is a key route for reskilling and upskilling, and that's one of the very worrying effects of these changes. I think there are important lessons to be learned from the devolved, and particularly Wales, in terms of its overall attitude, because if we want to try and remedy these problems that we're seeing in England, we have to question whether loans are the best instrument for improving access for this group of students. What we have to do is we have to move away from a one-size-fits-all policy approach. We have to let go of this notion that there must be a level playing field. There has always been a tussle about we should be treating full-time and part-time, especially in Brown, equally. But actually that's wrong. They're different people. Their learning aims are very often very different. And actually we have to be much more imaginative about the way in which we provide student support for different student groups. And of course, if you do anything to advantage part-time students, there'll be hues and cries from the rest of the sector concerned about full-time students. One idea that I have with John Thompson is that at no additional unit cost, as I said, sorry, let me go back. As I said, in 2018, maintenance loans are being introduced. We have calculated that at no additional unit cost, we could convert that maintenance loan into a grant. And so actually part-time students could have a grant for 2 years to pay for their, basically to pay for their tuition. We reckon they could pay £200 tuition, and the RAD charge on our proposal would be the same as the RAD charge on maintenance loans. In other words, give students an option, take out a maintenance loan, or actually pay a minimal £200 tuition fees and get the grant for the rest. So there are things that we could do to improve the situation, and lessons to be learned from the devolved.
any more questions from that? I know I've got one hand waiting, so we'll take the reindeer next. Anna, do you have any questions?
Claire, it's very, very interesting, but this is, it seems to me that this is just part of a wider problem with the whole funding system prioritising full-time university education, because the same argument could be made for all of vocational education, whether it's full-time or part-time. There's not a level playing field. You have a number of people going to university who should not be doing it. That's because you get no upfront support for doing vocational degrees. And it seems to me it would be very, very easy to change. You could do a degree has so many units, a vocational has so many units, you get a loan for a unit. It doesn't matter if you do 1 unit a year or 8.
Yep.
Well, why limit the system? So I guess I worry about the terminology about loans being the problem. I think it's design and and what you're proposing, I think, is just to make it free, isn't it? In essence, it's so why don't we just I think just the terminology, taking away the loans, you mean free for some forms of things. I just think we need to be explicit. I think there's a huge problem clearly with loan design in this country and the choices being made. The idea that you can have competition and markets when you've got income contingent loans is just crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no incentives.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
Can
think
we
better
take,
design.
we take one more question for this question? That's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Nick Olin from HEPI. You set up an argument, I mean, I agree very much with what you said, but you talked almost as if you were arguing against the political consensus, and I think Francis at the end said that was a controversial talk. It seems to me it's remarkably uncontroversial. Actually, you're reflecting now a consensus. I mean, this week we've had Daily Mail on the front page say, save the Open University and argue for a subsidy. We've had the Prime Minister say that part-time student funding should be in the current funding review. We've had the Universities Minister say that. So when you've got even the right-wing press and the Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet effectively saying what you're proposing is likely to occur in the next year or two, I'm not sure this is quite as radical as we're thinking. Isn't this, aren't we now on a course where this is all bound to almost happen?
Well, I mean, firstly, it's bound to happen. It was bound to happen with Brown and with the white paper. It was bound to happen, but look what happened. The bound to happen doesn't mean you get good policy. It means you get attention to it. And I'm delighted that we finally got attention. I'm delighted that the Daily Mail are doing whatever they're saying. But come on, if there had been a 51% decline in full-time enrollment, what would have happened for full-time students? Tell me the political fallout of a 51% decline amongst full-time students.
I completely agree.
It just, so for me, the frustration is, we've been sort of saying this, and okay, we've now got, we've now got better data because we've got longer data, so we can, I can spout it with greater confidence instead of doing it after just 1 year of data or 2 years of data. Great. But actually getting things moving. So maybe, I'm not saying, I've been saying this for a very long time. So there's nothing new at OneNote in what I have said, and I acknowledge that. It's just what the political reaction is to this. And also the thinking behind it, including, as Lorraine rightly says, there are very serious design faults with loans for this particular group of students. And my concern is the extent to which they will be acknowledged, because my concern is the extent to which policymakers on the whole keep on in their head they have an 18-year-old school leaver in mind. This is what informs policy. Both the 18-year-old school leaver who enters the labour market for the first time, and then we've got that lot, and then we've got Oxford and Cambridge telling us what policies, or dictating and influencing what policies we have. You put those two together. Ironically, both Oxford and Cambridge have very good part-time provision. They don't any longer. But if you take those two forces together, you get a funding system that is completely inappropriate for this group of students. That's my concern. So I'm not. There is nothing controversial. I've been saying it for years, and I acknowledge that. It's just that it's how do we get the thinking so that the policy response is one that is appropriate for this group. And that's my concern.
Do you want to say anything finally to Lorraine?
Well, I did. I was just acknowledging, you're completely right, that it's the design of the loans. Yeah.
Okay, it's time for one last question if there are any hands. I see no questions, so it's now my great pleasure to thank Claire once more for her talk.